They called her the Shadow of St. Catherine's. To the staff at Riverside Medical Center, she was just Morgan, the soft-spoken, graying nurse who refilled IV bags and changed dressings without complaint. But when a former Army Ranger stood up in the middle of a packed emergency department, his voice breaking with emotion as a cocky resident mocked her, the silence cut like a knife. He didn't just speak up. He fell to one knee. "You don't know who you're looking at," he said, his voice trembling. "This woman isn't just a nurse. She's the only reason my entire squad came home breathing." And when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't just shake the hospital. It brought the entire community to its knees. The fluorescent lights in Riverside Medical Center's emergency department buzzed with a relentless, headache-inducing hum that Morgan Taylor had memorized over the past 6 years. At 43, Morgan moved through the chaos with the kind of practiced invisibility that made her almost ghost-like. She was there when you needed her, gone before you could thank her. Her graying hair was always pulled into a tight, no-nonsense ponytail, and her scrubs were clean but worn thin from countless washes. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything extraordinary. Most people didn't even remember her name. "Nurse, I specifically ordered 75 milligrams of Demerol, not 50. Are you incapable of following simple instructions?" The voice sliced through the controlled chaos like a scalpel through skin. Dr. Benjamin Ashford, the hospital's newest and most insufferable trauma resident, stood beside a patient's gurney, his arms crossed, his expression dripping with contempt. Ashford was 29, blessed with the kind of chiseled features that he clearly spent hours admiring in mirrors, and cursed with an ego that could barely fit through the emergency department's sliding doors. He was a legacy hire. His uncle sat on the hospital's executive board, and he treated the nursing staff like they were beneath his notice. Morgan didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the patient's monitor, her expression neutral. "The patient has a documented allergy to higher doses of opioids, doctor. His chart indicates respiratory depression with anything above 50 milligrams. I adjusted the dose to prevent complications." Ashford's face flushed an angry crimson. He hated being corrected, especially by Morgan, who never laughed at his jokes, never complimented his surgical techniques, and never seemed impressed by his pedigree. He stepped closer, invading her space. "I am the physician here, Morgan. You are a nurse. Your job is to follow my orders precisely as I give them, not to second-guess my clinical judgment. Do you understand me?" The emergency department went still. Other nurses suddenly became very interested in their computer screens. Patients shifted uncomfortably in their beds. A few family members in the waiting area stopped mid-conversation to watch. "Understood, doctor," Morgan said quietly. Her voice was flat, emotionless. She turned toward the medication dispensary to retrieve the higher dose, her movements calm and measured. In the corner of the waiting area, slumped in a wheelchair that seemed too flimsy for his frame, a man watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. He looked rough around the edges, a thick, unkempt beard streaked with gray, a faded army jacket that had seen better days, and a baseball cap pulled low over weathered features. He'd been waiting for nearly 4 hours to get his knee looked at, the joint swollen and angry from old shrapnel that still shifted under the skin. This was Marcus Hawk Morrison. To most people, he looked like just another homeless veteran, someone to be pitied or avoided. But beneath the worn exterior was 230 pounds of former Army Ranger, medically retired after an IED tore through his patrol in Kandahar. He watched the doctor berate the woman. He watched her accept it without resistance. But something caught Hawk's attention, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was the way Morgan stood when she wasn't actively working. Her feet were shoulder-width apart, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, her weight balanced perfectly. It was parade rest, military posture, ingrained so deeply it became automatic. And her eyes, when the doctor shouted, she didn't look afraid or intimidated. She looked like she was assessing him, calculating threat levels, and finding him wanting. "Hey," Hawk grunted to a passing orderly, a young guy with nervous energy. "Who's that nurse?" The orderly glanced over. "That's Morgan. She's been here forever. Keeps to herself mostly. Dr. Ashford's been riding her hard all week." Hawk's eyes narrowed further. He knew that stance. He'd seen it in the mountains of Afghanistan, in field hospitals under mortar fire. He just couldn't place where. The shift dragged on, the tension between Dr. Ashford and Morgan thickening like smoke. The emergency department was slammed. A multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate had sent a wave of critical patients flooding through the doors. "Trauma Bay 1, incoming!" a paramedic shouted, bursting through the entrance. "Male, mid-30s, massive tension, pneumothorax, blood pressure crashing fast." The gurney slammed into the trauma bay with a metallic crash. The patient was gasping, his lips turning a frightening shade of blue, his chest barely moving. Dr. Ashford was there immediately, snapping on gloves with exaggerated confidence. "Get me a chest tube tray. Move, people, move." Morgan was already there, the tray prepared and ready before he'd finished speaking. Ashford grabbed a scalpel, his hands trembling slightly despite his bravado. The pressure was intense. The patient's oxygen saturation was plummeting. "I can't get a line," a junior nurse called out, panic creeping into her voice. "Veins are collapsed." "I drill," Ashford barked. "Intraosseous line now." But Ashford was struggling. The patient's anatomy was distorted from the trauma, the landmarks he needed obscured by swelling and blood. He tried to make the incision for the chest tube, but his hands wavered. The angle was wrong. He was second-guessing himself. "Doctor, his saturation is at 58, Morgan said, her voice cutting through the noise with unmistakable authority. It wasn't loud, but it commanded attention. "You're aiming too inferior. You're going to puncture the diaphragm." "I said shut your mouth," Ashford screamed, sweat pouring down his temples. "I know exactly what I'm doing." He didn't. He pushed the trocar in at the wrong angle, and the telltale hiss of escaping air never came. The patient convulsed violently. "He's coding!" someone shouted. The monitor erupted in a shrill, continuous alarm. The line went flat. Ashford froze. He stared at the monitor, his face going pale, the reality of his mistake crashing down on him. The patient was dying on his table because he'd been too arrogant to listen. Suddenly, Morgan moved. It wasn't the movement of a middle-aged nurse tired from a long shift. It was explosive, precise, almost violent in its efficiency. She stepped directly into Ashford's space, using her hip to knock him bodily aside. He stumbled backward, crashing into a tray of instruments. "What do you think you're doing?" Ashford started. "Quiet," Morgan hissed. It wasn't a suggestion. In one fluid motion, she grabbed a 14-gauge angiocatheter from the tray. She didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess. She palpated the patient's chest, located the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, and drove the needle in with absolute confidence. Hiss! The sound of trapped air escaping filled the room. The patient's chest heaved, his lungs expanding. The monitor beeped, a rhythm returning, slow at first, then stronger. "Needle decompression successful," Morgan stated, her voice returning to that flat, mechanical tone. She turned to the junior nurse. "Prep for formal chest tube placement. Higher insertion point this time. I'll guide you through it." Ashford stood against the wall, his mouth hanging open. Everyone in the trauma bay was staring. He'd just been physically removed from his own patient by a nurse, and she'd saved the man he'd nearly killed. Humiliation burned through him like acid. He straightened his coat, his eyes turning cold and vengeful. "Get out," Ashford whispered, his voice shaking. Morgan looked at him calmly. "Doctor, the patient still requires—" "I said get out," Ashford screamed, grabbing a metal basin and hurling it across the room. It clattered loudly against the wall, the sound echoing through the now silent emergency department. "You're suspended. You assaulted a physician. You practice medicine without a license. Get out of my emergency department before I have security drag you out in handcuffs." Morgan didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply nodded once, pulled off her blood-stained gloves, and walked out of the trauma bay, her head high despite everything. Hawk, who'd been watching from just outside the bay, felt electricity shoot down his spine. Needle decompression. The way she'd held that catheter, the way she'd moved, the precision. And that hip check, that was a close-quarters combat maneuver, the kind used to clear doorways in hostile situations. And then, as Morgan walked past him, her shoulders squared despite her defeat, Hawk saw it. She reached up to wipe sweat from her neck, and her scrub top shifted. Just below her collarbone, barely visible, was a jagged scar. It looked like a burn, shaped vaguely like a starburst. But it wasn't the scar that stopped Hawk's heart. It was the small, faded tattoo on her inner wrist, partially hidden by her watch, a caduceus wrapped in barbed wire with tiny wings. Hawk gripped the arms of his wheelchair so hard his knuckles went white. He knew that symbol. It was unofficial, unauthorized. It belonged to a specific, devastating operation in the Korengal Valley, Operation Titan's Gate. "No way," Hawk whispered, his voice hoarse. "It can't be her." He spun his wheelchair around, ignoring the sharp pain shooting through his knee. "Nurse Morgan!" he called out. She didn't stop. She was heading for the exit, grabbing her jacket from a hook. Ashford stormed out of the trauma bay, still riding his adrenaline and fury. "And don't even think about coming back," he yelled after her. "I'll make sure you never work in healthcare again. You're a liability, a nobody." Hawk's vision went red. He pushed himself up out of the wheelchair, his bad knee screaming in protest, but he locked it and stood. He wasn't a patient right now. He was a ranger. "Hey!" Hawk roared. The sound was like a thunderclap, a command voice forged in combat zones and parade grounds. Everyone in the emergency department froze. Dr. Ashford stopped mid-stride. Hawk limped forward, dragging his injured leg, moving into the center of the room. He pointed a shaking finger at Ashford. "You need to shut your mouth right now," Hawk growled. Ashford blinked, confused and indignant. "Excuse me? This is a hospital, sir. Sit down before you hurt yourself." "I said shut it," Hawk barked. He turned his gaze to Morgan, who had stopped at the automatic doors. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with recognition and fear. She saw him standing there. She saw the understanding in his eyes. And for the first time in years, Morgan looked genuinely terrified. "Don't," she mouthed silently, shaking her head. Hawk ignored her. He looked back at Ashford, his eyes blazing. "You called her a nobody. You said she practiced without a license." Hawk reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a challenge coin, heavy and worn. He held it up. "Do you know what this is, Doctor?" Hawk asked, his voice thick with emotion. "This is from 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, the Iron Panthers." He pointed at Morgan. "I was there 8 years ago. We were pinned down in a valley most people couldn't find on a map. We had 18 wounded, no extraction, no air support, just us and the Taliban closing in." The room was absolutely silent. "We had a combat medic with us, or we thought we did. She was attached to a female engagement team, supposed to be handling local women and kids, but when the bullets started flying, she didn't hide. She took command." Hawk took a step toward Morgan, his voice breaking. "She kept me alive for 7 hours with a sucking chest wound and a severed artery. She ran through mortar fire 4 times to drag my team leader back to cover. She performed an emergency amputation with a field knife to save our demolitions guy." His voice was shaking now. "We called her Angel. We never knew her real name because everything about her was classified, black operations, but I'd recognize her anywhere." Morgan shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Marcus, please," she whispered. Hawk looked at Ashford, his eyes burning with fury. "You want to fire her? You want to lecture her about medicine, doctor? This woman has forgotten more about trauma care than you'll learn in your entire career. She's a decorated officer. She's the reason I'm standing here today." Ashford scoffed, crossing his arms defensively. That's absurd. If she was some kind of war hero, why would she be working as a nurse here? She's lying, and you're delusional. She's not lying. A new voice rang out from the hospital entrance. Everyone turned. 3 people stood there. 2 were in dark suits, clearly federal agents. Behind them was an older man with silver hair, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Ashford made in a month. He walked with a slight limp, leaning on a cane, but his posture was military straight. It was Senator David Harriman, but to anyone who knew military history, he was General Harriman, retired. General, Ashford stammered, his arrogance finally cracking. The hospital administrator, who had appeared due to the commotion, went pale. General Harriman ignored the doctor entirely. He walked straight toward Morgan, his expression softening. "We've been looking for you for a long time, Commander," Harriman said gently. "You disappeared after your discharge. You didn't even come to the ceremony." Morgan looked down at the floor. "I didn't do it for the medals, General. I just wanted to disappear." "I know," Harriman said, "but you can't hide who you are forever, not when fools like this." He gestured vaguely at Ashford. "Try to tear you down for doing the right thing." Harriman turned to Hawk. "Good to see you, Sergeant Morrison. Stand down. I've got the watch." Hawk nodded, sinking back into his wheelchair, exhausted but grinning fiercely. Harriman turned his cold, steel-blue eyes on Dr. Ashford. "You just suspended the recipient of the Silver Star and the Defense Superior Service Medal. Do you have any concept of how catastrophic a mistake you just made?" Ashford's jaw dropped. The silence didn't last. It was shattered by the sharp click of expensive shoes on tile. "What in God's name is going on here?" The voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with barely concealed menace. It belonged to Charles Ashford, the hospital's chief operating officer and Benjamin's uncle. He was a man who wore authority like armor, impeccably dressed, intimidating, and used to getting his way. He'd been in a board meeting upstairs when word reached him about the chaos in the emergency department. Benjamin Ashford immediately straightened, pointing an accusing finger at Morgan. "Uncle Charles, this nurse assaulted me. She hijacked my patient, performed an unauthorized procedure, and now this vagrant is making wild accusations." Charles Ashford's eyes swept the scene. He ignored Hawk in his wheelchair. He ignored the stunned staff. His gaze landed on General Harriman. "General Harriman," Charles said, his tone icy, "I wasn't aware you were visiting our facility. I assume you're not here to contribute to this circus." "I am the ringmaster today, Charles," Harriman replied, his voice calm but hard as granite. "And if you want to save this hospital from a public relations catastrophe that will end careers, including yours, I suggest we move this conversation to your office, now." Charles paused. He looked at Morgan, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the way she stood beside the general, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. He recognized danger when he saw it. "My office," Charles snapped. "Benjamin, come with me. You too, Miss Taylor." "The sergeant comes with us," Morgan said. It was the first time she'd spoken in minutes, and her voice was no longer the flat monotone of a subordinate. It was the sharp command of an officer. Charles sneered. "This isn't a shelter, Miss Taylor." "He's my witness," Morgan said. "And if he doesn't come, I walk. And if I walk, the general makes some phone calls." Charles's jaw tightened visibly. "Fine." The chief operating officer's suite was designed to intimidate, all dark wood paneling, leather furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. It was a throne room. Morgan sat in one of the chairs, her back straight, hands folded calmly in her lap. Hawk wheeled himself beside her, still gripping his challenge coin. Benjamin Ashford paced behind his uncle, pouring himself a drink from a crystal decanter, his hands still shaking. "This is absolutely insane," Benjamin spat. "She nearly killed a patient. She assaulted me." "She saved a patient you were actively killing," Hawk interjected, his voice low and dangerous. Enough! Charles slammed his hand on the desk. He turned his predatory gaze to Morgan. Miss Taylor, let's dispense with the theatrics. My nephew tells me you physically assaulted him. That's grounds for immediate termination and criminal charges. I don't care if you have some medal from a war 8 years ago. That doesn't give you the right to run my trauma bay. It wasn't just a medal, Charles, General Harriman said from where he stood near the door. It was the Silver Star. Do you know how many women have received that honor in the past 20 years? I don't care, Charles retorted. This is a liability issue. She's a nurse. Her scope of practice is strictly limited. If that patient had died... He didn't, Morgan said calmly, turning to look at him. Her eyes were cold, unreadable. Because I understand the anatomy better than your nephew does. Benjamin flushed crimson. I am a board-certified physician. I trained at... You panicked, Morgan said, her voice cutting through his protest like a scalpel. You lost situational awareness. Your hand tremors started when the oxygen saturation dropped below 70. You were fixated on the procedure and ignored the patient's physiology. You were going to kill him, Benjamin. I stopped you. How dare you? Benjamin started. She's right, Hawk said flatly. I've seen combat medics work under mortar fire with steadier hands than you had in a climate-controlled room. Charles stood up, his face darkening with anger. I will not sit here and allow a nurse and a drifter to insult my nephew. Miss Taylor, you are fired, effective immediately, and I will personally ensure your nursing license is revoked in every state. You will never work in healthcare again. General Harriman laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. Go ahead, Charles, Harriman said. Fire her. Revoke her license. But before you do, you might want to review the personnel file I just had the Department of Defense unseal and send to your office. The intercom on Charles's desk buzzed. Mr. Ashford, a courier just delivered a classified package. It's marked for your immediate attention. Department of Defense. Charles hesitated. He pressed the button. Bring it in. A nervous assistant hurried in, placed a thick manila envelope on the desk, and practically fled. Charles opened it. Benjamin leaned over his shoulder. As they read, the silence grew heavier, suffocating. Subject: Taylor, Morgan E. Rank, Lieutenant Commander, 04. Designation: Special Operations Combat Medic, Medical Officer, Attached Units, 75th Ranger Regiment, 5th Special Forces Group, Joint Special Operations Command. Charles flipped the page, his hands beginning to tremble. Incident Report. Operation Titan's Gate. Location: Korangal Valley, Afghanistan. Summary: While under sustained enemy fire, Lieutenant Commander Taylor performed emergency field surgery on 3 critically wounded personnel, coordinated close air support after the forward air controller was incapacitated, and single-handedly defended a casualty collection point for 7 hours. Sustained multiple gunshot wounds. Refused medical evacuation until all critical personnel were stabilized and extracted. Charles stopped reading. He looked up at Morgan, the woman in faded scrubs who made $30 an hour. You're a physician, Benjamin whispered, staring at the file in disbelief. You have a medical degree from Johns Hopkins. You're board-certified in emergency medicine and trauma surgery. I was, Morgan said quietly. I haven't worked as a physician since I came home. Why? Benjamin asked, his arrogance replaced by genuine confusion. Why are you working as a nurse? You could be chief of surgery anywhere in the country. Morgan looked down at her hands, the hands that had saved hundreds of lives and failed to save the ones that haunted her dreams. Because I didn't want the glory, doctor, she said. I didn't want the ego. In the field there are no titles. There's just blood and dirt and the person next to you fighting to survive. I became a nurse because I wanted to care for people, not preside over them. I wanted to do the work, not chase accolades. She looked up at Charles. I didn't assault your nephew. I saved his career. If that patient had died on his table due to negligence, the lawsuit would have cost this hospital millions. I intervened. I did the job. And then I stepped back. Charles Ashford was a businessman above all else. He calculated risks and assets. He looked at the file, then at his nephew, then at the general standing like a sentinel by the door. He realized he was holding a live grenade. "If I fire you," Charles said slowly, carefully, "the general goes to the media. The story becomes that Riverside Medical Center fired a decorated war hero for saving a life." "Correct," Harriman said. "And if I keep you?" Charles asked. "Then I go back to work," Morgan said, "as a nurse, and your nephew learns some humility. And maybe, just maybe, you start treating the veterans who come through your doors with a little more dignity." Charles closed the file. He took a deep breath, visibly struggling with his ego. "Get out of my office," he said to Morgan. "Return to your shift. We'll review the incident internally." It was a retreat. Temporary, fragile, but a retreat nonetheless. Morgan stood. She nodded to General Harriman, then looked at Hawk. "Come on, Sergeant. Let's get that knee properly evaluated." As they left the office, Benjamin Ashford slumped into a chair, defeated. But in his eyes, a new fire was kindling. Not humility, not respect, pure, distilled hatred. He'd been humiliated in front of his uncle. He wouldn't forget. He wouldn't forgive. The victory in Charles Ashford's office felt hollow. Morgan knew men like the Ashfords. They didn't accept defeat gracefully. They regrouped, strategized, and struck back harder. By the time she wheeled Hawk back to the emergency department, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The whispers stopped when she walked by. Nurses who'd barely acknowledged her existence for 6 years now stared, their eyes darting to the scar on her neck, imagining the stories hidden beneath. She hated it. She despised the attention. For 6 years, she'd cultivated invisibility. It had been her shield, her protection. Now it was gone, stripped away. "You holding up okay, Angel?" Hawk asked as she examined the swelling around his knee with practiced efficiency. "Don't call me that," Morgan muttered, applying a fresh compression bandage. "I'm just Morgan." "You're never just Morgan," Hawk said. "Not anymore. You saw the phones out there, right? Half the waiting room recorded what happened." He was right. By the next morning, the video titled, "Homeless Veteran Exposes Arrogant Doctor, Reveals Secret War Hero Nurse," had over 4 million views on YouTube and was trending on every social media platform. The comment section was explosive. "That doctor should be fired immediately. Who is she? Someone find out her story. Give this woman a medal. Wait, she already has one. Riverside Medical is a disgrace for how they treat veterans." When Morgan arrived for her shift the next morning, news vans lined the street outside the hospital. Reporters thrust microphones at anyone wearing scrubs, desperate for quotes. Morgan pulled her hood up, kept her head down, and slipped in through the loading dock entrance. But inside the hospital, the storm was even worse. Dr. Benjamin Ashford was conspicuously absent. He'd taken an emergency personal leave. In his place, the hospital was swarming with lawyers in expensive suits, moving through the corridors like sharks. Morgan was summoned to Human Resources at 10 a.m. sharp. But it wasn't just the HR director waiting for her. Sitting at the conference table was a man in an immaculate charcoal suit, his expression bland and professional. Leonard Crane, the Ashford family's personal attorney, a corporate fixer. "Miss Taylor," Crane began, his voice smooth as oil, "please have a seat." Morgan remained standing, her arms crossed. "I have patience, Mr. Crane. Make this quick." Crane smiled thinly. He slid a document across the table toward her. It was a non-disclosure agreement, dense with legal language. "The hospital is prepared to offer you a settlement," Crane said. $300,000. In exchange, you will resign immediately, sign this NDA, and issue a public statement clarifying that the events captured on video were a misunderstanding and that Dr. Ashford acted appropriately throughout. Morgan looked at the document. It was a substantial amount of money, enough to pay off her mortgage, maybe take a real vacation for the first time in a decade. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Crane's smile vanished like smoke. "Then we open an investigation into your time in service, specifically the incident in Jalalabad, September 2019. Morgan felt the blood drain from her face. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Jalalabad. That file was supposed to be sealed permanently. "That operation is classified," she whispered. "Nothing stays classified if you know the right people," Crane said softly, leaning back in his chair. "We know about the civilian casualties, Morgan. We know about the collateral damage during the extraction. The official report cleared you. But the optics, a hero nurse involved in a raid where innocent people died. The media would crucify you. The Angel of Korangal would become a child killer overnight." It was a vicious, calculated blow. The incident Crane referenced was the nightmare that woke Morgan screaming at least 3 nights every week. A high-value target extraction in a crowded marketplace. Intelligence had been faulty. An explosive device had detonated prematurely, triggering a firefight. Morgan had tried desperately to save a young girl caught in the crossfire, while simultaneously returning fire to protect her team. She'd failed. The child had died in her arms as the helicopters extracted them. She'd blamed herself every single day since. "You're a monster," Morgan said, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "We're protecting the hospital's reputation," Crane said coldly. "Sign the paper, Morgan. Take the money. Disappear again. It's what you do best, isn't it?" Morgan stared at the pen lying on the table, the weight of her past pressed down on her like a physical force. She could end this now. Walk away. Let Benjamin Ashford win. She reached for the pen. Suddenly, the conference room door burst open. It wasn't General Harriman this time. It was a young resident, looking absolutely frantic. "We need help," the resident gasped. "Major trauma incoming. It's a school bus accident. Multiple pediatric critical injuries. The attending is completely overwhelmed." Morgan dropped the pen like it had burned her. The word pediatric cut through the blackmail and fear like a laser. "I'm in the middle of something," Crane snapped. "Get out." "They're children," the resident practically screamed. "We need every qualified person we have." Morgan looked at Crane. She looked at the NDA. Then she looked at the terrified resident. The shadow of St. Catherine's didn't negotiate with terrorists, and she sure as hell didn't negotiate with lawyers when children's lives were on the line. "Go to hell," Morgan said to Crane. She turned and sprinted out of the conference room. "If you walk out that door, we release everything," Crane shouted after her. Morgan didn't stop. She ran down the corridor, her mind shifting into combat mode. The emotional turmoil was compartmentalized, locked away. The tactical mind took over completely. She burst through the emergency department doors and stopped. It looked like a war zone. A school bus had rolled on the highway. Screaming children were everywhere. Blood pooled on the pristine white floors. Chaos reigned. The attending physician, Dr. Rachel Chen, was a good doctor, competent and caring, but she was drowning. She was trying to intubate an 8-year-old while simultaneously shouting orders that nobody could hear over the pandemonium. "Quiet," Morgan bellowed. The sheer volume and authority of her voice, honed on aircraft carrier flight decks and in the chaos of combat zones, cut through the panic like a blade. The room stilled momentarily. "Dr. Chen, focus on that airway," Morgan commanded, moving to the center of the room. "Nurse Patterson, triage station 3 needs immediate pressure dressings. Orderly, clear the hallways now. I want a clear path to radiology. You, and you." She pointed at 3 paralyzed interns. "Start IV lines. Green tags to the waiting area. Yellow tags to bays 6 through 10. Red tags stay here with me." "Who gave you authority?" a frantic nurse demanded. "I did," Morgan said, grabbing trauma shears from a nearby tray. "Now move." For the next 5 hours, Morgan Taylor wasn't a nurse. She was a battlefield surgeon conducting an orchestra of life and death. She moved from patient to patient, assessing injuries with frightening speed and accuracy. She caught a missed splenic laceration in a 9-year-old boy. She stabilized a compound fracture in a girl before shock could set in. She worked with mechanical precision that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying to watch. In the executive observation deck above the emergency department, Charles Ashford stood watching. He'd come down after Crane had called him, furious that Morgan had walked out. He watched the woman he was trying to destroy save his hospital from complete collapse. Beside him, Crane was on his phone. "I'm sending the Jalalabad file to the major news outlets now, Mr. Ashford. We'll bury her." Charles looked at the scene below. He saw Morgan holding the hand of a terrified little boy while simultaneously directing a resident on suturing technique. He saw the way the entire staff looked at her now, not with fear, but with absolute, unwavering trust. And for one brief, uncomfortable moment, Charles Ashford felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Shame. But then he thought of his nephew's humiliation, his family's reputation, the narrative he needed to control. "Do it," Charles said quietly. "Release the file." Down in the emergency department, Morgan wiped blood from her forehead with the back of her hand. The surge was over. The children were stabilized. She took a deep, shuddering breath, leaning against the nurse's station counter. Hawk rolled up beside her. He'd stayed, helping however he could, distributing blankets, talking calmly to frightened parents. "You were incredible, Angel," Hawk said softly. Morgan gave him a tired, sad smile. "It's over, Marcus. They're going to destroy me. They have the Jalalabad file." Hawk's eyes went wide. He knew about Jalalabad. Every operator did. It was a tragedy born of bad intelligence, not negligence. But the media wouldn't care about nuance. "They wouldn't," Hawk said. "They will," Morgan said. She untied her surgical mask. "I need to leave before the cameras come back." But as she turned toward the exit, the main entrance doors slid open. It wasn't the press. It wasn't the police. 5 people walked in. They weren't wearing suits or uniforms. They wore faded jeans, tactical boots, and fitted shirts that showed they still trained hard. They moved with predatory awareness, scanning the room automatically. The man in the lead was massive, standing 6'6", with a thick beard and visible tattoos running up his arms. He looked around the emergency department until his eyes locked on Morgan. He stopped. His weathered face broke into an enormous grin. "Well, I'll be damned," the giant boomed. "We thought you were dead, Angel." Morgan froze. She knew that voice. It was Master Sergeant Leo Bear Kowalski, her old team sergeant. And he hadn't come alone. The reunion in the middle of Riverside Medical Center's chaotic emergency department was a collision of 2 worlds Morgan had fought desperately to keep separate. Bear Kowalski didn't just hug Morgan. He engulfed her in an embrace that lifted her off the ground, the scent of gun oil, leather, and old tobacco engulfing her like a physical memory of safety. "We saw the video," Bear rumbled as he set her down, keeping his massive hands on her shoulders. "The one with the Ranger. Viper caught it on Instagram of all places. We knew that posture. We knew that look in your eyes. We caught the first flight out of Fort Bragg." Behind Bear, the other 4 stepped forward. There was Viper, a sniper with eyes that seemed to catalog every exit and threat in the room simultaneously. Tex, the demolitions expert with a grin that seemed permanently etched on his face. Martinez, the communications specialist who could hack anything with a signal. And Doc Ramirez, the man who'd replaced Morgan when she'd left the unit. "You look like hell, Angel," Viper said, his grin widening. "You look like trouble," Morgan shot back, her voice cracking despite her best efforts. For the first time all day, the carefully constructed mask slipped completely. She wasn't the nurse. She wasn't the officer. She was just Morgan, and these were her brothers. Hawk wheeled himself closer, his expression a mixture of awe and respect. "You guys served with her?" Bear looked down at the ranger in the wheelchair. He saw the prosthetic leg, the scars, the haunted look that never quite left a combat veteran's eyes. He nodded solemnly. "She saved our asses more times than I can count. You're the one who stood up for her?" "Yes, sir," Hawk said. "Then you're with us," Bear said firmly. "Anyone who covers her six covers ours." But the moment of warmth shattered like glass when a breaking news alert blared from the television mounted in the waiting room. Breaking news. The angel or the executioner? Riverside medical nurse accused of war crimes. The room went silent. Morgan turned slowly, her face draining of color as she looked at the screen. Her face, pulled from the viral video, was displayed beside a grainy photograph of a destroyed marketplace in Jalalabad. The headline was bold, red, and utterly damning. The news anchor, a woman with severe features and a practiced tone of grave concern, spoke with rehearsed gravity. Sources within the hospital administration have leaked a previously sealed military file alleging that Morgan Taylor, the nurse recently celebrated as a hero, was involved in a botched operation in Afghanistan in 2019 that resulted in the deaths of multiple civilians, including at least one child. The report suggests possible violations of the laws of armed conflict and rules of engagement. The air left the room. Patients Morgan had just treated, mothers whose children she'd stabilized, elderly patients she'd comforted, all looked at her. The gratitude in their eyes evaporated, replaced by suspicion, fear, and horror. "Is that true?" a mother whispered, instinctively pulling her daughter closer. "Did you kill children?" Morgan felt like she'd been shot. The physical pain of a bullet would have been preferable to this, the Jalalabad operation, the nightmare she'd spent years running from, the failure that haunted every quiet moment. It wasn't like that, Morgan tried to say, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "She's a murderer," a man shouted from the back of the waiting area. "Get her away from the kids." "No!" Hawk yelled, spinning his wheelchair to face the growing crowd. "That's a lie. You don't understand the context." But mob mentality had taken hold. Fear spreads faster than truth ever can. Dr. Chen, the attending who had relied completely on Morgan just hours before, looked down at her tablet, unable to meet Morgan's eyes. Morgan looked at Bear, her eyes pleading. They released it. Charles Ashford released it. Bear's face transformed from jovial to absolutely terrifying. The friendly giant disappeared. In his place stood a Tier 1 operator. "Who is Charles Ashford?" he asked, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet. "The chief operating officer," Morgan whispered. "And his nephew is the doctor I corrected." Morgan backed away, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "I can't be here. I can't do this." She turned and ran. She pushed through the double doors, sprinted down the corridor, and burst out into the ambulance bay. The cool evening air hit her face, but she couldn't breathe. She leaned against the brick wall, sliding down until she hit the pavement, burying her face in her knees. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere shifted from shock to menace. Security guards were moving toward the emergency department. Bear watched Morgan run. He didn't chase her immediately. He knew she needed a moment. Instead, he turned to his team. "Viper, secure the perimeter," Bear ordered. "Nobody, and I mean nobody, gets near her. Tex, you're on communications. Find out who leaked that file. I want names, I want addresses." "Already on it," Tex said, pulling out a ruggedized tablet. "Digital forensics in progress. Source traces back to a law firm, Crane and Associates. Timestamp shows the leak originated 23 minutes ago." Bear looked at Hawk. "Where is this Charles Ashford right now?" Hawk pointed upward. "Executive suite, top floor, penthouse office." Bear cracked his knuckles. "Doc, you stay with Angel. Keep her safe. Hawk, you're with me. We're going to have a conversation with management." "I can't walk, Sergeant," Hawk said, frustration evident. "I didn't ask you to walk," Bear said, grabbing the handles of Hawk's wheelchair. "I need a witness, and you look like you've got plenty of righteous anger to share." Charles Ashford was celebrating in his penthouse office. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand, watching the news vans multiply below like parasites. "It's done, Leonard," Charles said to Crane, who sat on the leather sofa looking pleased. "Social media is exploding with #NurseKiller. The board will have no choice but to terminate her immediately to protect the hospital's image. The lawsuit regarding Benjamin will disappear because her credibility is completely destroyed." Benjamin Ashford, who had returned to the office, looked less certain. "But the file, it was classified. Isn't leaking it illegal?" Crane waved a dismissive hand. "It was leaked anonymously. It can't be traced back to us definitively. Besides, who's going to investigate? The military wants to forget Jalalabad just as badly as she does." Charles took a satisfied sip of bourbon. "You see, Benjamin, in the real world, the truth doesn't matter. Perception matters. We control the perception." Boom. The heavy mahogany doors didn't open. They exploded inward. The locking mechanism shattered, sending splinters of expensive wood across the pristine carpet. Charles jumped, bourbon sloshing over his hand. Crane scrambled off the sofa. In the doorway stood a mountain of a man with a beard like a Viking warrior, pushing a wheelchair containing a furious-looking ranger. Flanking them were 3 other men who radiated controlled violence. "Security!" Charles screamed, reaching for his desk phone. "Don't bother," Martinez said, leaning casually against the shattered doorframe. "Your security is currently taking an involuntary nap. We had a chat about priorities." Bear rolled Hawk into the center of the opulent office. The air suddenly felt thin and charged with danger. "Who are you?" Crane demanded, trying to summon his legal authority. "This is private property. I'll have you arrested for breaking and entering." Bear ignored him completely. He walked directly up to Charles Ashford. Bear towered over the executive, leaning in close enough that Charles could see the individual scars on his face. "You have exactly 10 seconds to explain why you decided to destroy a good woman's life," Bear said quietly. It was terrifying precisely because it was so calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," Charles stammered, backing up until he hit his desk. "She's a liability. She violated protocol." "She tried to save a child," Hawk roared from his wheelchair. "That kid was strapped with explosives. Morgan threw herself over the girl trying to cut the wires. The device detonated. She took shrapnel trying to save an enemy combatant's daughter while under fire. You son of a—" The room went silent. Benjamin Ashford looked at Hawk, then at his uncle. "Is that what actually happened?" "It doesn't matter," Crane interjected. "The report mentions civilian casualties. That's all the public needs to know." "You're the lawyer, right?" Bear asked, turning his terrifying focus to Crane. "I am," Crane said, straightening his tie defensively. "And I know the law. You can't touch me." "I'm not going to touch you," Bear said. "He is." Bear pointed to the door. General Harriman walked in, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him were 6 federal agents wearing windbreakers emblazoned with NCIS, FBI, and DOJ. Charles Ashford's face went from flushed to ashen in seconds. "What is this?" Charles whispered. "This," General Harriman said, holding up a sealed evidence bag containing a USB drive, "is the result of tracing a leak of top-secret, sensitive compartmented information. You see, Mr. Crane, when you access that file from the secure DoD server using the verification credentials I foolishly provided to this hospital, you left a very clear digital footprint." Harriman stepped closer. "And when you transmitted it to multiple news organizations via email, you committed a federal crime. Leaking classified operational data, even historical data, puts active personnel and assets at risk. That file contained the names of local interpreters and sources who are still operating in theater. You just signed death warrants." Crane collapsed into the chair, his arrogance evaporating. "I didn't know. I only wanted the summary." "Ignorance isn't a defense," one of the FBI agents said, stepping forward with handcuffs. "Leonard Crane, you are under arrest for violations of the Espionage Act and unlawful disclosure of classified national defense information." Charles tried to distance himself. "I didn't send anything. It was him. He's my attorney acting independently." "We have your text messages, Charles," Harriman said coldly. "Release everything. Bury her." Sent at 6:47 p.m. yesterday. A second agent moved toward Charles. "Charles Ashford, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate federal statutes regarding classified information and obstruction of justice." As the handcuffs clicked onto Charles's wrists, Benjamin Ashford stood frozen against the wall, watching his powerful uncle being led away like a common criminal. "Benjamin," Harriman said. The young doctor flinched. "You're not under arrest," Harriman continued. "But the State Medical Board is receiving a comprehensive report on your conduct in the trauma bay, including sworn statements from nursing staff who have been very forthcoming about your pattern of negligence and intimidation." Benjamin slumped against the wall, his career effectively destroyed. Bear turned to Hawk. "Ready to go?" "Where?" Hawk asked. "To the media circus," Bear said. "They made this mess. We're going to clean it up." Down in the hospital's main lobby, the scene was absolute bedlam. Reporters were shouting questions. Cameras were everywhere. The hospital's public relations spokesperson, a terrified woman named Susan, was trying desperately to hold a press conference. "Please, we are conducting an internal investigation into all allegations." "Move," a voice boomed. Bear Kowalski stepped onto the small platform that had been set up. He didn't look like a hospital administrator or a lawyer. He looked exactly like what he was, a soldier. The room went silent. Behind him, General Harriman, Hawk, and the rest of the squad lined up in formation. "My name is Master Sergeant Leo Kowalski, United States Army, retired," Bear said into the cluster of microphones. "I was the team sergeant for the operation in Jalalabad that you're all running stories about." The cameras zoomed in, every lens focused on him. "Morgan Taylor, Lieutenant Commander Morgan Taylor, is being called a war criminal today. I'm here to tell you what actually happened in that marketplace." Bear paused, looking directly into the main camera lens. The target was a bomb maker responsible for 17 attacks on coalition forces. He used his family as human shields. When we breached the location, he activated an explosive vest on his 8-year-old daughter. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled press. Every single person in that room, myself included, took cover. Morgan Taylor ran toward that little girl. She tried to disarm the device while taking fire from the target. The blast threw her 15 feet and embedded shrapnel in her neck and shoulder. She woke up screaming, not from pain, but because she couldn't save that child. Bear's voice wavered, then hardened. She carried the guilt of that day for 8 years. She left medicine because she felt she didn't deserve to heal anyone. But today, I watched her save 17 children from a bus accident, while the people who leaked this classified file sat in an office drinking expensive liquor. Bear stepped back, and General Harriman stepped forward. The individuals responsible for leaking classified information out of context have been arrested by federal authorities, Harriman announced. The narrative ends here. Morgan Taylor is not a war criminal. She is the finest officer I have ever had the privilege to command. Riverside Medical Center is fortunate to have her, even if she's only changing bedpans. The room erupted with questions shouted over each other. But Morgan wasn't there to see it. She was still sitting on the curb outside the ambulance bay, staring at her trembling hands. She heard the door open behind her. She didn't turn around. "Did they arrest them?" she asked quietly. "Better," Hawk's voice said. "The general arrested them, and Bear gave the press the real story." Morgan turned. Hawk was there, with Bear and the entire team behind him. It's over, Angel, Bear said gently. The truth is out there now. The real truth. Morgan stood slowly, wiping tears from her face. She looked at her old team, the people who knew her better than anyone. She looked at the hospital that had tried to destroy her. I can't work here anymore, Morgan said. Not after all this. Good, General Harriman said, stepping out from the doorway, because I have a different offer for you. Morgan wiped the last tear from her cheek. I'm done with the military, General. I'm done with all of it. I know, Harriman said with a slight smile. This isn't military and it isn't nursing. General Harriman led Morgan away from the ambulance bay toward his black SUV parked discreetly near the service entrance. Bear, Hawk, and the team maintained a respectful distance, understanding this was a conversation Morgan needed to have. The board of directors at Riverside Medical Center is holding an emergency session right now, Harriman explained, leaning against the vehicle. With Charles Ashford in federal custody and the hospital's reputation in free fall, they're desperate. They need a new face, someone the public trusts implicitly, someone with unimpeachable credentials. Morgan laughed bitterly. You want me to be their puppet? Smile for cameras and make people forget the chairman was a traitor? No, Harriman said firmly. I want you to run the entire emergency and trauma department. Morgan stared at him like he'd lost his mind. I'm a nurse, General. Technically, I'm a fired nurse. You're a trauma surgeon with active board certifications in 4 states and a decorated officer with combat command experience. Harriman corrected. I hold significant controlling interest in the healthcare consortium that owns this hospital. I just activated those shares. I'm removing the entire executive structure. I'm installing new leadership in trauma and emergency services. He extended his hand. I want you to take the position, Morgan, but not just to run the emergency department. I want you to transform this hospital into a flagship for veteran care and trauma medicine. I want you to hire people like Doc Ramirez and Bear. I want you to build the system you wished existed when you came home. Morgan looked at the hospital, the building where she'd been invisible and safe for 6 years. She looked at Hawk sitting in his wheelchair, broken by a system that had treated him like an inconvenience. On one condition, Morgan said. Name it. Hawk runs veteran services and patient advocacy, Morgan said, nodding toward the ranger. And we establish a dedicated pro bono clinic for veterans. No insurance questions, no bureaucratic delays, no turning people away. Harriman smiled broadly. Done. When can you start? Give me a week, Morgan said. I need to process everything that just happened. 6 months later, the automatic doors of Riverside Medical Center slid open to a completely transformed space. The sterile, anxious silence that had characterized the waiting room was gone. It was busy, efficient, and remarkably calm. At the front reception desk stood a man in a sharp suit, walking with only the slightest limp, aided by a state-of-the-art prosthetic. It was Hawk Morrison. He wasn't homeless anymore. He was the director of Veteran Services and Patient Advocacy. He knew every regular patient by name, and when he spoke, even the most agitated visitors calmed down out of respect. In the trauma bay, a Friday night rush was in full swing. Trauma Bay 2, incoming, a paramedic shouted. GSW to the abdomen, BP dropping. The doors crashed open. A young doctor stepped forward, cocky and fresh from residency, uncomfortably reminiscent of Benjamin Ashford. All right, everyone. I need full labs, immediate CT, and clear the space. I'm the attending here. He physically pushed a young nurse aside. Suddenly, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Dr. Stevens, a voice said. It wasn't loud, but it carried absolute authority. Dr. Stevens froze. Dr. Morgan Taylor stood at the entrance to the trauma bay. She wasn't wearing faded scrubs anymore. She wore a pristine white coat with Dr. Morgan Taylor, Chief of Emergency Medicine and Trauma Services, embroidered on the chest. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing the faded caduceus tattoo on her wrist. Her hair was still pulled back practically, but her eyes were sharp as surgical steel. Chief, I was just taking command of— You pushed Nurse Martinez, Morgan said, walking closer. The entire emergency department stopped to watch. In my hospital, we do not push our team. The team keeps patients alive. You are simply one component. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, Stephen stammered, sweat forming on his forehead. Good, Morgan said. She stepped up to examine the patient. Now, your entry angle suggests possible hepatic involvement. If you rush to CT without stabilizing his pressure, he'll code in the hallway, secure the airway, stabilize hemodynamics, then imaging. Clear? Crystal clear. On it immediately, Stevens said, getting to work with newfound humility. Morgan watched for a moment, then turned to walk away. She passed Bear, who was working as the senior trauma technician and educator. He gave her a subtle, approving nod. She walked into the hallway where Hawk was waiting. Smooth, Hawk grinned. He'll learn, Morgan said, or he'll find another hospital. Speaking of other hospitals, Hawk said, handing her a tablet. You should see this. Morgan looked at the screen. A local news report showed a familiar face looking haggard and defeated. It was Benjamin Ashford. He was loading boxes into a moving truck. The caption read, Disgraced physician loses medical license, files for bankruptcy. Adjacent to that story was another. Former hospital executive Charles Ashford sentenced to 18 years in federal prison for Espionage Act violations. Morgan handed the tablet back. She didn't feel satisfaction or vindication. She just felt a sense of closure, a chapter finally, definitively ended. Dr. Taylor? Morgan turned. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, stood there holding her mother's hand. The mother looked exhausted, worn down by life's struggles. Yes, sweetheart? Morgan asked, her expression softening immediately. My mom said you're the lady who saved the bus kids, the girl said shyly. She said you're a hero. Morgan knelt down so she was eye level with the child. She thought about the medals locked in a drawer at home. She thought about the child in Jalalabad she couldn't save. She thought about the years spent hiding from her own identity. I'm not a hero, sweetheart, Morgan said with a gentle smile. I'm just a nurse who remembered she was also a doctor, and sometimes that's enough. She stood and looked at her team. Hawk, Bear, the nurses, the staff who had become her family. Come on, Morgan said to Hawk. We have work to do. As she walked back into the organized chaos of the emergency department, head high, shoulders back, Morgan Taylor was no longer the shadow. She was the commander, and everyone knew exactly who she was. The legacy of silence had ended. The era of leadership had begun,